Welcome back to HOA Neighbor Wars. I thought it would be a warning. It was a campaign. Karen stood by an icy patch with a flashlight and yelled that she was documenting a hazard, and if anyone slipped, I would be liable, and the HOA would fine me for negligence today. This conversation is not a debate, it is a directive, she snapped, waving the beam across my driveway like she was marking evidence at a crime scene. I stood there in my black winter jacket with the hood up, breath fogging in the morning cold, holding a small notepad with wet pages and wondering how reflective snow stakes had turned into a federal case. Janet Nelson, Design Review Board Vice Chair for Snowline Heights HOA in Fort Collins, Colorado, had decided my driveway markers were prohibited structures, and she was not taking questions. She aimed the flashlight at the row of thin orange stakes I had hammered into the frozen ground along the edge of my driveway 2 days ago. They were the kind you buy at any hardware store, reflective tape wrapped around fiberglass rods so the plow driver does not scrape your asphalt or hit your mailbox. Janet treated them like I had installed a neon billboard. She pulled a tape measure from her coat pocket and stretched it across the width of one stake, muttering numbers under her breath. I am on probation at a new job and one more late arrival ends it, I told her, glancing at my phone. I work as a data analyst and the morning commute window is tight. She did not look up. She kept measuring, her knit hat slipping forward as she crouched lower. This is a violation of Article 7, unapproved exterior modifications, she said, standing up and brushing snow off her knees. You signed the covenants, now you live the covenants. I asked her which line in Article 7 banned snow stakes. She did not answer. Instead, she reached into a canvas tote bag and pulled out a laminated policy sheet. No readable text but enough bold headings to look official, and held it between us like a shield. I can make this a lean conversation in one email, she added, her voice dropping into that fake calm register people use when they are about to ruin your week. I wrote that line down in my notepad, word for word, because I knew it was going to matter later. Janet turned and walked back toward the clubhouse entrance, her boots crunching through the frozen slush. I watched her go, then looked down at the stakes. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to do, keeping the plow operator from destroying my driveway. Snowline Heights is one of those communities where the compliance chair carries a ruler and a stopwatch, where every curb edge and mailbox height gets documented in quarterly audits, where people peek through frosted blinds and text each other about whose trash cans are out past 8 in the morning. I had moved here 3 months ago after a job transfer, and I was still rebuilding my routine. The stakes were supposed to make winter easier. Instead, they triggered an enforcement wave I did not see coming. By noon, the first notice arrived. It was taped to my front door in a plastic sleeve. Snow already starting to pile on the corners. The heading said Emergency Compliance Review, and the body text demanded I remove the stakes within 24 hours, or face a $200 fine plus daily penalties. The notice was signed by Janet and countersigned by the HOA manager, a name I had never seen in person. No hearing, no appeal window, just a countdown. I took a photo of the notice with my phone, then checked the group chat for Snowline Heights homeowners. 3 new messages had appeared in the last hour, all from Janet, all with the same tone, reminding everyone that winter modifications required advance approval and that enforcement would be immediate this season. I called the management company and got voicemail. I sent an email and got an auto reply. I drove to the clubhouse and found the office locked, a handwritten sign on the door saying the manager was out until Thursday. I stood there in the parking lot, wind cutting through my jacket, and realized I was being stonewalled on purpose. The 24-hour deadline was designed to make me panic and comply before I could organize a defense. I went home and started digging through my closing documents, looking for the actual covenant text. Article 7 was 3 pages long and covered everything from fence heights to satellite dishes, but there was no mention of snow stakes, driveway markers, or seasonal safety equipment. I highlighted every relevant section and saved the file. That night, I got a text from my neighbor 2 doors down, a retired teacher named Phil who had been in Snowline Heights for 8 years. He said Janet had been in the group chat earlier that week coordinating a targeted winter enforcement wave, and he had screenshots. I asked him to send them. 5 minutes later, my phone buzzed with a chain of messages showing Janet, the HOA manager, and 2 other board members planning a sweep of driveways, sidewalks, and front yards to catch anyone who had made changes without submitting an architectural request. One message from Janet said, "We need to hit them fast before they have time to lawyer up." Another said, "Use emergency powers so we do not have to hold a hearing first." I saved every screenshot. I stopped arguing and started collecting, because the end game was already set. Phil offered to testify if it came to a meeting, but he was scared. Janet had blocked his deck repair approval twice in the past year, and he did not want to give her another reason to target him. I told him I understood, but I needed him to be ready. He said he would think about it. I stayed up late that night building a timeline. When I installed the stakes, when Janet showed up, when the notice arrived, when the group chat messages were sent. The pattern was obvious. This was not about safety or compliance. This was about control. The next morning, Janet was back. She was standing in my driveway at 7, holding a salt bucket and pointing at it like it proved her case. She said the stakes were creating a slip hazard because they were directing foot traffic into an icy zone near my mailbox. I looked at the spot she was pointing to. There was no foot traffic. The sidewalk ran along the other side of the property line and the mailbox was set back from the curb. She was inventing a problem to justify the fine. I asked her if she had filed an incident report. She said she did not need to because the hazard was self-evident. I asked her if she had measurements or photos. She pulled out her phone and started taking pictures right then, making a show of zooming in on the ice patch and the nearest stake. I told her I was documenting this interaction too, and I opened the voice memo app on my phone. Her expression changed. She lowered the salt bucket and took a step back. "You cannot record me without my consent," she said. I told her Colorado is a one-party consent state, and I was the one party. She turned and walked toward her car, still holding the bucket, muttering something I could not hear. I watched her drive off, then checked the time. I was already 15 minutes behind schedule. I grabbed my work bag and headed out, knowing I was about to be late again, and knowing my probation window was closing. If you are enjoying this HOA chaos, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories where the rules backfire on the enforcers. By the time I got to work, I had 2 new emails from the HOA management company. The first was a formal notice of architectural violation with a new fine attached, $300 for failure to remove unauthorized structures within the compliance period. The second was a scheduling notice for an emergency hearing set for tomorrow night at 6, mandatory attendance. Failure to appear would result in automatic lien processing. The hearing was timed to conflict with my work shift, and I had no doubt that was intentional. I forwarded both emails to Phil and asked him if he could attend as my witness. He said he would try, but he could not promise anything because Janet had already called him that morning asking if he had talked to me. I spent my lunch break looking up Colorado HOA law and found a statute that said emergency enforcement powers could only be used for immediate threats to health or safety, and they required board approval within 72 hours or the action was void. I printed the statute and added it to my file. I also found a city ordinance that said homeowners could install temporary seasonal markers on their own property without a permit as long as they did not block public right-of-way. I printed that too. I was building a case, But I knew Janet was not going to back down just because I had paperwork. She wanted a fight, and she was willing to bend every rule to win it. That afternoon, I got a call from Phil. He said he had been thinking about it, and he was willing to testify, but he wanted me to know that Janet had just submitted a new complaint against him for a supposedly unapproved holiday wreath on his front door. He sounded exhausted. I told him I appreciated his help and I would make sure the board knew what she was doing. He said he hoped I knew what I was getting into. I told him I did, but I was not sure I had a choice. The stakes were still in my driveway, and I was not taking them out. The hearing was held in the clubhouse community room, a space with folding tables and stackable chairs, and a projector screen that no one ever used. I arrived at 6 and found Janet already seated at the front table with the HOA manager and 2 other board members. She had her cheap plastic badge clipped to the outside of her coat, even though we were indoors, and she had a 3-ring binder open in front of her with tabs sticking out in every direction. The manager was a man in his 50s with a tie and no jacket, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else. The other board members were a woman in her 60s who kept checking her phone and a younger guy in a fleece who had not said a word since I walked in. Phil was sitting in the back row, hands folded on the table in front of him, looking nervous. There were 5 other homeowners scattered around the room, all of them watching, but none of them speaking. Janet cleared her throat and called the hearing to order. She said this was an emergency compliance review under Article 12, Emergency Powers, and that I was being given an opportunity to respond to the violations before the board voted on enforcement. I asked if I could present evidence. She said I could speak for 3 minutes and then the board would deliberate. I asked if I could call a witness. She said no. This was not a trial. I stood up and placed my printed covenant pages and the city ordinance on the table in front of me. I said the stakes were legal under city code, they were not mentioned anywhere in Article 7, and the Emergency Powers Clause required board approval within 72 hours, which had not happened. Janet cut me off. She said the board had approved the enforcement action in a closed email vote, and she did not need to provide me with the vote record because it was an internal matter. I asked when the vote took place. She said it was none of my business. I asked the HOA manager if he had a copy of the vote. He looked at Janet, then looked at me, and said he would have to check his files. Janet stood up and started reading from her binder, listing every supposed hazard the stakes were creating. Foot traffic redirection, visual obstruction, non-conforming appearance, unapproved material composition. She went on for 5 minutes, ignoring her own 3-minute rule. When she finally stopped, I asked if I could respond. She said the board was ready to vote. I said I had not been allowed to present my evidence. She said I had already spoken and my time was up. The woman on the board looked uncomfortable. The guy in the fleece was staring at his phone. The manager was flipping through a folder and not making eye contact with anyone. I pulled out my phone and opened the screenshots Phil had sent me. I said I had evidence that this enforcement action was coordinated in advance and that the emergency powers claim was pretextual. Janet slammed her binder shut. She said I was not allowed to present group chat messages without consent from all participants. I said the messages were sent in a homeowner association communication channel and were subject to disclosure under Colorado law. The manager looked up. The woman on the board leaned forward. The guy in the fleece finally put his phone down. I held up my phone and started reading the messages out loud. Janet said, "We need to hit them fast before they have time to lawyer up." The manager replied, "Agree. Use emergency powers to skip the hearing." Janet replied, "Perfect. I will draft the notice tonight." I paused and looked at the board. I said this was not an emergency. This was a planned takedown. And the group chat proved it. Janet stood up and said I was violating privacy rules and she was ending the hearing immediately. I said I was not done. She said she did not care. She motioned to the other board members and said they were voting now. Phil stood up in the back row. He said he had screenshots too, and he was willing to testify that Janet had been targeting multiple homeowners with coordinated enforcement actions all winter. Janet spun around and glared at him. She said he was out of order and he needed to sit down. He stayed standing. He said Janet had blocked his deck repair twice with no explanation, and he was tired of being harassed. The woman on the board said she wanted to see the screenshots. The guy in the fleece said this did not sound like an emergency to him. The manager closed his folder and said he needed to speak with legal counsel before any vote took place. Janet lost it. She said the board had already approved the enforcement, the vote was valid, and if they did not back her up, she would resign and let them deal with the liability. The manager said there was no liability because the stakes were legal under city code. Janet said the city code did not override the covenants. I said the covenants did not mention stakes. She said they fell under exterior modifications. I said the city ordinance explicitly allowed temporary seasonal markers. She said the ordinance was irrelevant. The manager said it was not irrelevant, and he was calling the city tomorrow to confirm. Janet grabbed her binder and her bag and stormed out of the room. The door slammed behind her. The woman on the board looked at the manager and said they should table the vote until they had more information. The guy in the fleece said he agreed. The manager said he would send an email to everyone tomorrow with an update. I asked if the fine was being suspended. He said yes, pending further review. I asked if the lien threat was being dropped. He said yes. Phil came up to me after the meeting and said he could not believe she walked out. I said I could. She knew she was losing and she could not handle it. The next morning, I got an email from the manager saying he had spoken with the City Code Enforcement Office and confirmed that temporary seasonal driveway markers were permitted without approval as long as they did not exceed 4 feet in height or block the public sidewalk. He said the HOA would be sending a retraction notice to all homeowners by the end of the week, and that the fine against me was voided. He also said the board would be reviewing the emergency powers process to prevent future misuse. I forwarded the email to Phil and thanked him for backing me up. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji and said he was relieved. But Janet was not done. 2 days later, I got a new notice, this time claiming that the stakes were creating a drainage obstruction because they were diverting snowmelt into the street. The notice was signed only by Janet, no countersignature from the manager, and it included a new fine of $400, plus a demand that I submit a drainage remediation plan within 5 business days. I read the notice twice and realized she was making it up as she went. There was no drainage problem. The stakes were on my property 6 feet from the curb, and snowmelt flowed downhill into the storm drain exactly the way it was supposed to. I called the manager and left a message. I sent an email with photos of the driveway showing no drainage obstruction. I heard nothing back. I called again the next day and got voicemail again. I started to wonder if Janet had pressured him into staying silent. I checked the group chat and saw that she had posted a new message saying she was conducting a compliance audit of all properties on my street, and that violations would be documented and fined without further notice. 3 neighbors replied asking what violations she was looking for. She did not answer. I decided to escalate. I printed every email, every notice, every screenshot, and every photo, and I put together a complaint packet to submit to the Colorado HOA Regulatory Office. I included a cover letter explaining the pattern of harassment, the misuse of emergency powers, and the fabricated violations. I mailed it certified with return receipt. I also sent a copy to a local attorney who specialized in HOA disputes and asked for a consultation. He replied the same day and said he could meet me on Friday. On Thursday, Janet showed up again. This time she had a ruler. She walked up to my driveway, crouched down next to the stakes, and started measuring snow depth around each one like she was running an investigation. She wrote numbers in a small notebook, took photos with her phone, and muttered to herself the whole time. I watched from my front window, filming the whole thing on my phone. She did not knock. She did not leave a notice. She just measured and photographed for 10 minutes, then walked back to her car and drove off. I sent the video to Phil and to the attorney. The attorney replied within an hour and said Janet was engaging in harassment and I should file a police report if she came back. I said I would. Phil replied and said half the neighborhood was talking about her now, and people were starting to push back. He said another homeowner had filed a complaint about her blocking a fence approval for 8 months with no explanation. He said the board was fracturing and Janet was losing support. That Friday, I met with the attorney. He reviewed my packet and said I had a strong case for both harassment and procedural violations. He said the emergency powers misuse alone was enough to void every fine, and the group chat screenshots showed intent to target me without cause. He said if the HOA did not back down, he could file a lawsuit for declaratory relief and attorney fees, and the HOA would almost certainly lose. He also said the fabricated drainage violation was potentially fraudulent and I should report it to the state. I asked him how much it would cost to proceed. He said he could start with a demand letter for $1,500, and if it went to court it would be more, but the HOA would be liable for my fees if I won. I told him to send the demand letter. He drafted it that afternoon and emailed me a copy for review. It was 3 pages long and methodically dismantled every action Janet had taken, citing statute numbers and case law. It demanded retraction of all fines, a written apology, and immediate cessation of all harassment. It gave the HOA 10 business days to comply or face litigation. I approved it and he sent it certified mail on Monday. By Wednesday, the management company called me. The manager said he had received the demand letter and he wanted to resolve the matter without litigation. He said the board had held an emergency meeting and voted to void all fines against me, retract all notices, and issue a formal statement clarifying that seasonal driveway markers were permitted. He also said Janet had been placed on probation and would no longer be handling compliance matters alone. I asked if the board was going to address the group chat evidence. He said they were conducting an internal review and would issue findings within 30 days. I said I wanted the findings in writing. He said he would make sure I got a copy. I thought that was the end of it. I was wrong. 2 days later, I was pulling into my driveway after work when I saw Janet standing in the street with a salt bucket. She was ripping open a bag dramatically, and salt was scattering everywhere, white crystals bouncing across the asphalt and onto the curb. She was yelling at no one, just yelling into the cold air, saying something about negligence and liability and how the board had betrayed her. I parked and got out of my car. She spun around and pointed at me. "You think you won," she said, "but you have no idea what you have started. The whole neighborhood is going to suffer because of you." I pulled out my phone and started recording. She saw the phone and panicked. She dropped the salt bag and it hit the ground with a thud, more salt spilling out. She turned and walked fast toward her car, slipping slightly on the scattered salt. I kept recording. Just then, a police cruiser turned onto the street, driving slow because of the snow. The officer saw Janet, saw the salt spill, saw me holding my phone, and pulled over. He got out and asked what was going on. I said I was a homeowner documenting a harassment incident. Janet said I was the one harassing her and she was documenting safety violations. The officer looked at the salt spill and asked who made the mess. Janet said I did. I said she did, and I had video proof. The officer asked to see my phone. I handed it to him and he watched the clip. He handed it back and looked at Janet. He asked her why she was spreading salt in the middle of the street. She said she was addressing a slip hazard. He asked her if she worked for the city. She said no, she was HOA compliance. He said the HOA did not have authority over public streets and she needed to clean up the salt. She said she would. He asked for her name and address. She gave it. He asked for mine. I gave it. He said he was going to file a report and if there were any more incidents, he would come back. Janet got in her car and drove off. The officer stayed and talked to me for another 5 minutes. I told him about the HOA dispute, the harassment, the fabricated violations, and the demand letter. He said he could not get involved in a civil dispute, but if Janet continued to show up on my property or in the street making a scene, I could request a restraining order. He said the video I had was good evidence and I should keep it. He also said the salt spill was a public nuisance, and if it happened again, he could cite her for littering. He gave me his card and said to call if I needed anything. Then he got back in his cruiser and drove off. I went inside and sent the video to my attorney, to Phil, and to the HOA manager. The attorney replied and said the video was perfect evidence of ongoing harassment and I should file a police report to create a formal record. I said the officer already filed one. He said good. Request a copy. I called the non-emergency line and requested a copy of the report. They said it would be available in 72 hours. I thanked them and hung up. That night, the HOA board held another emergency meeting. I found out about it from Phil, who texted me saying Janet had tried to call a vote to overturn the board decision and reinstate my fines. The board shut her down. The woman board member stood up and said Janet had violated multiple procedural rules, ignored management advice, and created legal liability for the association. The guy in the fleece said he was tired of the drama and he wanted Janet removed from the compliance role immediately. The manager said he had reviewed the group chat evidence and confirmed that the enforcement action was coordinated without proper board approval, which meant it was void from the start. Janet tried to argue. The woman board member cut her off and called for a vote. The motion passed 4-1. Janet was the only no vote. Phil said Janet screamed that she quit and stormed out for the second time in 2 weeks. He said the board appointed an interim compliance officer and passed a resolution requiring all future enforcement actions to be approved by 2 board members and the manager before any notice could be sent. He also said the board voted to send a formal apology letter to me and to issue a community-wide notice clarifying the rules on seasonal markers. I asked him how the room reacted when Janet walked out. He said people started clapping. The next week, I got the apology letter. It was signed by the board president and the manager, and it acknowledged that the enforcement actions taken against me were improper, that the fines were voided, and that the association would be implementing new oversight procedures to prevent future abuse. It also included a check reimbursing me for the attorney consultation fee. I deposited the check and sent a thank you email to the board. 2 weeks later, the state regulatory office sent me a letter saying they had opened an investigation into the Snowline Heights HOA based on my complaint. They said they would be conducting interviews and reviewing records, and they would notify me of their findings within 90 days. I forwarded the letter to my attorney and he said it was a good sign. He said if the state found violations, they could impose fines on the HOA and order policy changes. A month after that, the board held a special meeting to vote on new enforcement policies. Phil invited me to attend as a guest. The room was packed with homeowners who had been targeted by Janet over the years. The board president stood up and presented a new set of rules requiring written justification for all fines, mandatory appeal windows, and independent review for any enforcement action over $100. He also announced that the board was hiring a new management company because the current one had failed to provide adequate oversight. The motion passed unanimously. Janet was not present. In the spring, I got a call from a city inspector confirming what the HOA cannot enforce. He said he had been contacted by the state regulatory office as part of their investigation, and he wanted to verify that my driveway markers complied with city code. I met him at my property, and he measured the stakes, checked the placement, and took photos. He said everything was legal, and he would be submitting his report to the state. He also said the HOA had been put on notice that any future attempt to enforce rules that conflicted with city code would result in penalties. I thanked him, and he left. 2 months later, the state regulatory office sent me their final report. They found that the Snowline Heights HOA had violated multiple procedural requirements, including improper use of emergency powers, failure to provide adequate notice and appeal rights, and retaliation against homeowners who challenged enforcement actions. They ordered the HOA to publish standards and timelines to all homeowners, implement mandatory training for board members, and pay a fine of $5,000 to the state. They also placed the association on probation for 1 year, meaning any future violations would result in escalated penalties. I forwarded the report to Phil, and he replied with a celebration emoji. He said the neighborhood felt different now, like people were not afraid to push back anymore. He said 2 more board members had stepped down and been replaced by homeowners who actually cared about fairness. He said Janet had moved out of Snowline Heights, and no one knew where she went. I kept the reflective stakes in my driveway all winter. No one said a word. The plow driver thanked me for marking the edge clearly. My neighbors started putting up their own stakes. By the end of the season, half the street had them. The new compliance officer sent an email saying seasonal markers were encouraged for safety, and the association would not be enforcing any restrictions on them as long as they met city code. In the final board meeting of the year, the president stood up and said the association had learned a hard lesson about accountability. He said the new policies were working and complaints were down across the board. He also said the state had closed their investigation and removed the probation status early because the HOA had demonstrated good faith compliance. He thanked everyone who had spoken up and said the community was stronger because of it. I sat in the back row and thought about the icy morning when Janet stood in my driveway with a flashlight and tried to turn snow stakes into a federal case. I thought about the lien threat, the fabricated drainage violation, and the salt bag meltdown. I thought about the moment when a city inspector confirmed what the HOA cannot enforce, and the moment when Karen was outvoted so hard the room laughed, and the moment when the HOA had to publish standards and timelines to all homeowners. I thought about Janet's favorite fee getting proven imaginary in the ledger when the attorney reviewed the covenant and found no drainage remediation clause anywhere in the document. I thought about the cheap plastic badge she wore like it gave her authority, and the way she measured snow depth with a ruler like she was building a case for the Supreme Court, and the way she pointed at a salt bucket like it was Exhibit A in a trial that never happened. I thought about the hand warmer packet crumpled in her fist the morning she tried to document a hazard, and the way her voice dropped when she said she could make it a lien conversation in one email, and the way that line came back to haunt her when the board read it out loud at the meeting and asked her to explain what she meant. I thought about the laminated policy sheet she held between us like a shield, and the small notepad with wet pages I carried in my pocket, and the fact that I wrote down every word she said because I knew it was going to matter. I thought about the moment I handed the officer on scene the proof and asked for an incident number immediately, and the way Janet's face changed when she realized the video was not going away. I thought about the probation at my new job and the late arrivals, and the fear that one more disruption would end it, and the relief when my boss told me I had passed probation and my performance had been solid. I thought about Phil, who was scared but showed up anyway, and the way his voice shook when he stood up in the meeting and said he had screenshots too. I thought about the city inspector who confirmed the stakes were legal, and the state regulator who opened an investigation, and the attorney who wrote a demand letter that dismantled every lie Janet told. I thought about the board members who finally grew a spine and voted her out, and the new compliance officer who sent an email saying safety markers were encouraged, and the neighbors who started putting up their own stakes because they were not afraid anymore. I thought about the snow and the ice and the cold sun and the wind and the way winter tests everything, and the way some people use rules as weapons and some people use them as shields. I thought about covenants and emergency powers and drainage remediation plans that never existed. I thought about harassment and retaliation and the moment when the system finally worked the way it was supposed to. And I thought about the fact that I still live in Snowline Heights, and Janet does not, and the reflective stakes are still in my driveway every winter, marking the line between my property and the street, doing exactly what they were always supposed to do. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.